This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
You've got to wait for long enough for the trees to die, but the regrowth underneath will be starting up, and within 3 or certainly 4 years it can be getting fairly impenetrable in there because there's just massive regeneration under the dead macrocarpus.
Yeah, just masses of stuff that grew really, really quickly because they were sort of so sheltered from the wind but still got the rainfall, and of course the seed source from the birds perching in the trees, the dead trees, was just perfect conditions for regeneration.
Today's episode of Rewilding in Action is supported by the Rod Donald Banks Peninsula Trust, whose vision is to create a thriving and enduring ecosystem of trails and regenerating landscapes on Te Pā Takaora Kaihautu Banks Peninsula. Projects supported by the Rod Donald Banks Peninsula Trust are based on 4 strategic pillars, namely access, partnerships, knowledge and biodiversity. For more information about their projects and news, go to roddonaldtrust.co.nz. Kia ora, welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. Sometimes a very effective nursery species for natural native forest regeneration is a dead one. In this episode, I rejoin Bob Webster and his wife Carol Jensen above Little River on Banks Peninsula to find out about the technique of frilling and how they used it to tackle 3 dense macrocarpa plantations with the help of some running mates. In a nutshell, frilling a tree is a way of killing it that leaves it still standing, and I'll leave Bob and Carol to the details. But before we get started, if you haven't yet listened to episode 26 about Bob and Carol's own property that they are assisting to rewild, I recommend you do that first to give you a context for this episode. I asked Bob first about the macrocarpas that were growing next to their property and how the couple dealt with them.
The whole upper valley where our land is basically reverting to forest, or is an old original forest. And as soon as we bought the land, it was obvious there's this macrocarpa plantation up there in the middle of the valley, and it was the one feature of the valley which obviously was not going to regenerate to bush, and it was probably just the trees were just going to get bigger and bigger and more unmanageable, and there's nothing growing under them, so it was a monoculture. And so we thought it would be quite good if we could somehow eliminate those trees, and we contacted DOC about it, and they wanted them gone because they're unproductive trees. They're deformed trees, no use for firewood or timber. But there was never a priority for DOC. They weren't a particularly wilding species, but they were happy for them to go. So we were quite keen to do something about it, and initially we just thought, well, maybe we can deal with the scattered macrocarpas down near our property boundary, sort of set in amongst gorse and regenerating bush.
So were they actually coming over the fence?
Not really, no. All the macrocarpas were in the adjoining property, but potentially they could. But we just thought, well, we'll start controlling those in case that does happen. And we controlled those over a period of time. My wife and I just gradually floundered our way through the gorse and regenerating bush and got all those isolated macrocarpas. I think they had been planted. They weren't wildings themselves, but they'd just been sort of sparsely planted amongst a fairly rocky slope.
What method did you decide to do, and how did you come upon that method?
Yeah. Maybe Doc suggested it, this method, which is called frilling, which is just to cut around the trunk of the tree with a sharp hatchet and spray the cut with glyphosate mixture. And so that's what we did. We were just frilling around the trunk with a slight downward cut of the hatchet, and it seemed to work. And it's pretty quick, and it's easy to do, and it's very simple tools with just a hatchet. And we did have 1 or 2 very large macrocarpas, not in the plantation, elsewhere on our land that we had already dealt with by drilling. Doc had lent us a sort of petrol-driven drill, and they were pretty hard to kill. They were bigger trees, but carrying that drill around was horrific, and it would sort of screw your arms off if you weren't careful.
And so, Carol, what was your motivation for it?
Well, we had this feeling that if you could kill the macrocarpus and leave them standing dead, it would allow in a little bit of light and enough for the natives to germinate. And that's exactly what happened. Once the trees had died and the leaves had fallen off, there was enough light for natives to germinate, but not the gorse. There was absolutely nothing growing underneath the live macrocarpus, and it was obviously going to stay like that for many, many years.
And this was because they were growing so densely, wasn't it?
Yes, and they just didn't allow any light in. It was so dark. Not even ferns came away, so we wanted to get rid of them, although we hadn't thought at the start that we were going to get rid of them because we hadn't thought that far ahead and we didn't think we could. But after we got the ones near our boundary, we had a look through the forest, the plantation, and saw there were totara, quite sizable totara and fuchsia, that were dying because they were being shaded out by the macrocarpus. So we next went around and tried to kill off the macrocarpus surrounding the totara and the fuchsia to allow some light in, enough for them to survive. And that worked pretty well. And then we got carried away and carried on.
So at first you wanted a buffer zone, basically, but then that allowed you to move into the forest and see what was there and what was precious that you thought. So we'll just go back a little step, because the macrocarpa was in 3 different plantations, isn't that right?
Yep.
Each of them about 4 hectares?
Yep, each about 4 hectares, and we figured there were about 4,000 trees in each of the plantations, so potentially there might have been maybe 12,000 trees. That may be an overestimate, but certainly quite a few thousand trees in there. Yeah, we got lucky early on. A bunch of old running mates of mine came up and visited us early on when Carol and I were floundering around on our own, and they said, we can give you a hand with this, because they're sort of outdoors types and quite enjoyed doing a bit of conservation work. The whole thing grew a lot after that, because we had not just the 2 of us, but a team of 6 or 10 people in there, and that same core group stayed with us for the next 7 years, and actually quite enjoyed it, because it's a project, and you could sort of see the progress you were making, and as the trees died off, and eventually see the regeneration coming up underneath. And because we had a bunch of people like that, you sort of needed a method where you could equip everybody, and Doc also wasn't keen on machinery, chainsaws and things, so we kept it to hand tools and equipped everybody with a hatchet and a handsaw and a pair of loppers if they needed it, so that you could easily outfit 10 people or even a dozen with the gear they needed. And the beauty of the technique is there's not much noise, so you can talk to people while you're in the forest, and It's a social day. You'd hear this chop, chop, chop around through the forest, and people yakking away as they go and gradually work through an area, and really, a good day. Quite hard physical work.
And what time did you start at in the morning, and when did it finish?
Yeah, sort of not early, because everybody was coming from Christchurch, which is an hour away, and so generally arrive at our hut at about 9 o'clock and then walk in. It was up to an hour to walk to the macrocarpus, so you might start work at 10:30, work through till lunch, stop for lunch, and then another hour and a half or 2 hours after lunch, and maybe 3 o'clock. That's enough, everybody got a bit crazy of hacking into macrocarpus, so we'd just go back to the hut and at a viewpoint where we could look over on the plantation, sit down and have a ginger beer and a biscuit and look at what you'd done.
And Carol, so I guess you'd get faster at it, the job.
Yes, although we had to do a lot of trimming of the side branches, and so that took more time than the earlier plantations. But yeah, everyone had pretty good technique, and we probably did speed up a bit. But yeah, and the trouble was it was very, very steep, so you had to be sort of make sure you were pretty stable or you'd tumble down the hill. So.
But the two of you are very agile, I can attest to that. And what size were the trees? Were they all about a similar age and size?
Yeah, well, I assume they're all a similar age, but yeah, they did vary in width a bit. Probably 50 centimetres diameter on...
That's be the biggest.
The biggest, yeah. Some of them were narrower than that.
30.
And how many were you able to do in a day? Once you got into the swing of it.
Quite a few hundred. Yeah, I mean,
wow.
See, this has happened over a period of 6 or 8 years of our retirement. So we're 6 or 8 years older than we were when we started. So we might have got more technically capable, but we were getting older too. So I think our work rate slowed down towards the end. I'm sure it did. That's the same with
And you
everybody.
started going for the ginger beer a little bit sooner.
Yeah.
It's really, really tremendous. So we have to remember that it's around 10,000 trees. Do you
I think so. Yeah, probably. Could be more. Yeah, let's say 10,000. Because you do quite a few hundred every day. In fact, one person could do, if you really threw yourself at it, you could probably do a couple of hundred yourself. When we were younger.
And I think you can surpass most younger people, but also around 12 hectares of land on steep ground that you had to cross.
Yes. Yeah, but bear in mind that most of those plantations were, well, in fact, all the bigger parts of the plantations were easy to walk through because there's no undergrowth. It was not difficult to get around, apart from the fact that some of it was pretty steep. But towards the end it got harder because the last plantation we dealt with, the trees had a lot more side branches, and we needed to cut off all the side branches so you can even get into the tree. And we didn't leave any side branches on the tree below the cut line. That was a rule we followed. Potentially the lower branches might continue to grow, so we made sure we cut all the side branches off, and also so you could get into the tree. And that last plantation, every tree had masses of side branches, so there's often a first exercise to go through the forest and just trim those trees, and then we came in with the macrocarpa group and another day to frill them. The plantations have all required a second pass through them, and first time you go through you think you've got them all, but you won't have. There'll be some you will have missed, and other trees that you will have frilled the first time won't have died. There's probably a 90% kill rate, or 80 or 90%, but there's that percentage that don't die.
And I guess you don't know for a while, do you?
No, and you don't. You've got to wait until you're clearly dead, and that can vary. In the summer you can generally see the tips of the trees turning brown within about 3 weeks, but in winter that can take more like 3 months, and for the tree to lose its needles it can take probably a year or more. And until they lose their needles, when you look up, it's not obvious whether the tree's alive or not. So it can be quite difficult to work out whether the tree's dead. So you need to leave it for a year or two before you do the second pass.
And when we look across at them now, you can see how grey they are. They do look dead.
Oh, yes, they look definitely dead. And you can now, looking across at them, you can see the live trees, the ones that you haven't killed. They're clearly different. But there's a sort of a critical timing to getting in there if you want to kill those remaining trees, because you've got to wait for long enough for the trees to die. But the regrowth underneath will be starting up, and within 3 or certainly 4 years it can be getting fairly impenetrable in there, because there's just massive regeneration under the dead macrocarpas.
So, Carol, this was a big motivation, obviously, to allow the light to come in slowly and allow the regeneration to come back. So what did you see? What came through?
Yeah, well, we had wineberry and fuchsias, and not so much broadleaf for five-finger, did we? And I wondered whether the deer stopped that coming away. But marble leaf, mahoe, and lots of ferns. Yeah, just just masses of stuff that grew really, really quickly because they were sort of so sheltered from the wind but still got the rainfall. And of course the seed source from the birds perching in the trees, the dead trees, was just perfect conditions for regeneration.
So it would be really good to go through some of the specific benefits of macrocarpa frilling versus cutting down the macrocarpa or dealing with it or just letting them just stay there. So what are you seeing some of the benefits of that?
Well, I have seen areas where large macrocarpas have been cut down and there's just bare ground underneath them, but because you've got bare ground and seed and light, you get thousands of seedlings of macrocarpa.
And it's sudden.
It's sudden, yes. Whereas this is a gradual process. Gradually you're letting the light in and the moisture, and you've got birds dropping seed. And so it's that partial light from the leaf fall. It's just right for native regeneration.
And so the dead macrocarpa, are they very flammable when they're like that?
Well, I imagine they're quite flammable even when they're alive. But currently, if you can get a couple of years and you've got the regen, well, they would burn natives, but they're very, very lot of moisture. You know, the broadleaves and hebes and wineberry, they won't burn nearly as well. And that's such a dense cover underneath that I don't think, unless it was a fire higher up, the fire wouldn't even get going.
Yeah, so in fact having the natives come up underneath reduces the flammability of the whole forest.
And I think too, once the needles or leaves have fallen off the macrocarpas and you're just left with dead spars, there's not as much dry biomass to burn then, I wouldn't think. So once you've got that state plus the natives coming up through it, it's probably less flammable than the original macrocarpa plantation. But you will go through that stage where there's probably an increased fire risk due to just dying macrocarpa with dead leaves up there in the canopy. But it's probably a fairly short period of a couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah, and also you've got quite a lot of native bush around as well. And
that's sort of one of the reasons why I think it's been so successful with regeneration under the macrocarpas is that these plantations have been surrounded by existing areas of bush. So there's been a seed source nearby, which has helped a lot.
Do you think that the macrocarpas can get too big to be frilled?
No, they were still manageable, but they're probably 30 years old, those trees now, but they're still not huge. They're quite manageable to be frilled, but there's other methods of frilling too. I mean, we've used hatchets largely, but if they do get a bit bigger, you could frill with a battery-powered trimming saw or a small chainsaw or something. You could just cut a line around the trunk with that and spray glyphosate into the cut, and that would do it too. So I think the frilling method would work even on large trees, but with a really big tree, probably a hatchet might be hard work.
Let's go into a little bit of detail about the glyphosate.
Yeah, okay. Well, we've been using 360 glyphosate mostly, and for that we started off with 100 mils of glyphosate to 400 mils of water in a 500 mil half-litre spray bottle. But we thought the survival rate of the trees, was perhaps we could have got a better kill rate if we'd increased the concentration of glyphosate. So in the later part of the exercise, we increased it to 200 mils of glyphosate to 300 of water. And we also put in a tiny splash of red dye, just helps you know what you've sprayed and what else you've got glyphosate on. And apart from that, it was a hatchet, and I sharpened the hatchets with a flat file before every day, so they were quite razor sharp and easily cut into the bark of the macrocarpas. And so everybody had a hatchet, glyphosate bottle, safety glasses, and sort of spray-proof gloves with long arms on them. Yeah.
You're well kitted out.
You do need safety glasses because there's just lots of twigs everywhere and there's a bit of gorse around as well. And pocket saws are useful for cutting off side branches, and a pair of loppers for side branches as well. That's about it.
And as you say, it's a method where everyone could talk to each other.
Yeah.
And I think it's incredible that you had a group of people who've continued to work with you for so long,
Yeah.
not on their land, and in fact not even on your land, but who were so invested in it.
Yes.
Obviously there was enjoyment along with it.
Yes, there was. The social side of it was good because, you could chat getting down into the plantation, you could chat while you were working, you chat on the way home. That was good. But I think having a project where people could really see what they'd done and see how much they had done, how much they'd gained, and what the benefits were. It really clicked with everybody. It clicked with us, and it seemed to sort of fire everybody else up too, that they wanted to come back and do more.
Do you know, I'm just thinking that because the macrocarpa were on a hill, you could see how much is done.
Yes.
If it was all on the flat and you were on the flat, you wouldn't be able to see it. You might not have been so motivated.
It's really good to look at it, and Bob called it the wave of death. And so you could gradually see this wave of dead trees moving up the hillside.
However, I will say there's the wave of life underneath it.
Yes.
This is a rewilding episode.
Yeah, quite right. Quite so.
But yeah, that's what it's all about, really. Yeah. And transforming it into native bush.
Yeah.
So are there any drawbacks that you find with this approach?
Well, for a start, there's not 100% success, but there probably wouldn't be with any technique you used. I guess getting in there into the forest now is actually very difficult because macrocarpas are starting to collapse and the regeneration is getting so rampant in a lot of places it's hard to get through it. Plus there's bush lawyer tangled through it all and the falling trees, so it's quite hard to get in there. And we have discovered a few weeds in there now that weren't there originally.
I think we did pass by some Chilean flame creeper, just a little remnant of it.
We don't know how much of that there is, but we've found sort of half a dozen patches of that, and I've sort of formed a very rough track between them so we can hopefully get in there each year and at least pull it down out of the canopy so it doesn't flower and birds can't spread it. So that sort of thing's a worry. You don't know what weeds might come in, and it is difficult to get through and check what's there, so that's an issue.
Wow. Are there any other weeds that you're tolerating?
Yeah, we're not worried about the gorse in amongst the regen in there because, the gorse will eventually grow old and natives will be coming through it, and so it'll die out. We don't see that as a problem in there. It's just a problem to get through it. If you're trying to find other weeds, it just makes it difficult to travel through the areas, that's all.
So have you still got plenty of things keeping you busy?
I seem to. These people keep coming on to do podcasts and things.
Making you traipse all around the place.
No.
We just do our weed rounds once a year. We check all weeds that we know about and they're all GPS'd.
And you've got your trap lines?
Yeah, the trap lines, which we try and do once a week, but there's always something to do with them too, and some of them aren't working. We need to replace them.
And bird monitoring?
Yes. So once a year we have two very good friends who know their birds and come up and we do 5-minute bird counts on 3 sites. And so it gives us some information, although it is minimal with birds, isn't it? But you can't do much else because they move. Plants are much easier to monitor.
But if they are in the vicinity, it shows that the general ecosystem is a favourable one. But it sounds like you've got plenty more to do to keep you busy. Yeah. Probably extending your life, do you reckon, Carol?
I hope so. I like to think that it keeps me slightly fit, although that's problematic. I get slower and slower, but still, it's quite rough country, and so I think it's very good for agility to going around these rough tracks and steep bits and hanging on to the vegetation. No, it's good. I do enjoy it, and it's nice to be able to do it as long as I possibly can.
I'm full of thanks to my podcast guests, Bob Webster and Carol Jensen, for sharing how they and their friends tackled macrocarpas through the technique of frilling. It's a method with a lot of potential for densely planted plantations of any exotic species, where nothing is growing underneath, but where there's a native seed source nearby. Rewilding is all about making an intervention to kickstart native ecosystem processes, allowing nature to take the lead, and importantly, only intervening when necessary to allow native biodiversity to flourish. In this case, by frilling the macrocarpet trees, this has allowed natural native forest regeneration to occur. What Bob, Carol and their fit and determined friends have done is incredibly inspiring, and it's a testament to friendship and to their love of nature. So thank you for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard. In my next episode, I'm back on Banks Peninsula again to chat with Hugh Wilson from Hinawai Reserve. I hope he doesn't mind, but I regard Hugh as Aotearoa's leading advocate and practitioner of rewilding. It's his work there that first got me passionate about natural native forest regeneration. So until next time, I will leave you with some birdsong from a rewilding property. Many thanks again to Bob Webster and Carol Jensen, rewilders who are letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.